The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
Welcome to the Charlotte Podcast Festival. My name is Sarah Pollack. I'm the production manager at Queen City Podcast Network, and I'll be your moderator for this hour of the Charlotte Podcast Festival, Charlotte's first podcast festival, presented by WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source. Queen City Podcast Network, bear with me, it's been a long morning. Blumenthal Performing Arts, and Eclecs Creative Agency. This hour's session is called Don't Spend It All in One Place. Let's meet your host. So Bernadette Joy is the founder of Crush Your Money Goals. She teaches how behavior, relationships, emotions, and environment impact our money decisions after paying $300,000 off of her debt with her husband in just 3 years. Her style is inspiring, relatable, and is inspiring and relatable for those overwhelmed and overlooked by traditional financial services. She's featured in national and local media, including NBC News, MarketWatch, USA Today, and over 20 podcast appearances. At the end, we look forward to answering audience questions. While we ask that your audio remains muted for the session, you can leave your questions in the Zoom chat box, and we'll try to answer them towards the end of the hour. A reminder to the audience that this session will be recorded and made available over email. So make sure to check your emails, including your spam and junk folders this weekend to receive the session recording. We encourage you to check the full list of sessions on the Charlotte Podcast Festival website, which is charlottepodcastfestival.com, and share about the session on social media using the hashtag CLTPodcastFest. You can even support the festival by purchasing a brand new Charlotte Podcast Festival shirt from our website. That's charlottepodcastfestival.com. So with that said, let's get started. Hi, Bernadette.
Hello. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. I am so happy to be here. I have been on 4 different sessions with the Charlotte Podcast Festival, but I'll be honest, this one is probably going to be my favorite because it is my favorite topic, which is how do we save money doing the thing that we're trying to do here, right? And so just to give you a little bit more background, in addition to what Sarah mentioned about me, I am Bernadette Joy. I am the founder at Crush Your Money Goals. And today we're going to talk about budgeting, generally speaking, but more specifically, how do we apply this to our podcast endeavors? And so just to give you a little bit more, let's see, there we go. If you want to connect with me afterwards, you can find me at crushyourmoneygoals.com. And our mantra at crushyourmoneygoals.com is to live on your own terms, not your loan terms. And interestingly, this business was entirely credited. I can say that it was entirely started because of my podcast. And so to give you a little bit more background, 2 years ago, I started a podcast. It was called The Bernadette Joy Show. And the first season was called Crush This Debt. And that evolved over the years, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in my presentation, to turn into a full-fledged business, quit my day job, and this is what I do for a living now. And a lot of it started with just the idea of putting my story out in podcast format. So you can check us out at crushyourmoneygoals.com. And we have done 3 seasons so far. The first season, as I mentioned, was called Crush This Debt. And that season was 10 episodes. It was dropped Netflix style because I only have so much attention span. All of the episodes are 20 minutes or less, and it documents the story of how my husband and I paid off $72,000 of debt in a year on our student loans. And what I really loved about that project was that it was more of an audio journal. So it wasn't the traditional format of like interview style. We really took a lot of time to make it sound more like an audiobook with like sound effects and a lot more production than I am capable of doing. And so that was a really fun project. Season 2, I shifted to the more traditional format of interview style. And on that season, I also started making money on my podcast. And that is where I invited other experts to talk about their tips on how to crush debt and how to save money. And so that was a really fun season. I also turned that into a YouTube series. And then I thought I was done with podcasting, to be honest. I was like, my initial thought was I was just going to do the one season. And then I had just happened to do the second season because I still had some steam left. But then what ended up happening was I had my day job was a business called Dress, which was a local dress rental business here in Charlotte. And I decided to close that business, which was a really tough decision. And there were so many learnings that I had from closing that business, and invited other entrepreneurs to talk about the struggles that we've had and really dealing with the social pressure of entrepreneurship. So where a lot of other podcasts kind of focus on like, oh yeah, failure is like is the key to entrepreneurship and stuff. What I really wanted to talk about in the Undressed season 3 was, what are the social pressures that I really felt like we were dealing with, and what are some of the psychological aspects of entrepreneurship that people don't talk about. And we are currently in progress to do season 4, which is going to go back to my roots of one person, scripted, and it's going to be called Dear Bernadette Joy, and I'm going to be answering questions that people have asked about money and finances. And actually, Sarah has been helping me produce it, and you may hear Sarah's voice on it. So what we are going to talk about today is how to apply the Crush Your Money Goals theory and my system towards creating your podcast. And so how Crush Your Money Goals got started with the podcast is that, I will be honest, when I first started the podcast, my intention was to call it F This Debt. But then I figured out that was really hard for marketing purposes. And so we ended up changing the name of the podcast to Crush This Debt. And it turned out, when I looked in hindsight of all the things that people would consistently ask me for in terms of tips on saving money or building a business, it followed these 5 steps, and it happened to spell out the word crush. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk how you can crush creating your podcast. And so just to give you an overview of what those 5 steps are, and by the way, this also applies for anything other than podcasting. This applies for any financial decision. The first thing is cultivating a new and positive money mindset. That's what C stands for. R stands for reverse engineer your goals. U stands for use your resources efficiently. S stands for spend on what you love and spend on what matters. And then H, the good old-fashioned hustle, hustle, hustle. And these steps are in order on purpose, because what I often find, and this is especially true in podcasting, I would say, is that people will skip over the first 4 steps and go straight to like the hustle, hustle, hustle. How do I make money? That's the first question I always get from people about podcasts, like, how do you make money making a podcast? But I'm really a proponent that these first 4 steps have to come before you do the hustle part. So let us get right into it. And I'm going to pause during this session. Instead of waiting for the end to ask questions, I'll probably pause in between sections so that we can get a break from me talking, but also so that you guys have an opportunity to ask questions along the way. So the first step, cultivating a new money mindset. What do I mean by this? What I mean by cultivating a new money mindset is really understanding what your relationship with money is and how any of those positive or negative thoughts might be impacting your ability to make money, and in particular, monetize your podcast, right? And so some of the things that I personally had a hang up on was things like, well, I don't want to like do those like advertisements, and like who's going to want to sponsor my podcast? Who's going to want to pay for my podcast? Like, I'm new in this space. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I'm not worthy, total imposter syndrome, right? And so some of the things that I want to challenge you to do is that if you have any inkling of wanting to monetize your podcast is to get rid of the garbage that is preventing you from wanting to monetize it and the excuses that you're giving yourself as to why you might not want to do that. And so one of the other things that I think is super important and a really shift in my own mindset when it comes to spending money as it relates to my podcast and to my overall business is that not all costs are the same, right? And so there are two kinds of costs. There are expenses, which is simply the cost required to do something or the money that you're going to spend on something. And so, that's like everything under the sun, and everything can be an expense, but are you really focused on what we call investments, which is the action or process of spending money for profit or material result, right? And what I often find is that people confuse the two, and they're not the same thing. Just because you're spending money doesn't mean you're going to make money, and just because it's going to cost you money doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend it. And so I will give you a perfect example even today. Right before this session, I was going back and forth with a potential partner who can't wrap their brain around spending money on advertising with me, right? Totally fair, right? I'm like, hey, can you pay me $1,000 and I'm going to promote your company? And they're just not wrapping their head around it. And so the conversation that I've had to have with them is I understand $1,000 is no chump change for sure. But knowing what your business does, and in this case, this business is a financial planner, another financial advisor. I said, I know what your business is. I know this because I used to be your client. And this is why I would promote your business, because I actually believe in what you do. I'm not just reaching out to anyone and everyone to ask them for money. I've been very selective about who my partners would be. But aside from that, I know that it only require one new client for you to get and convert from this campaign to pay off this cost, right? Because I know what your business model is. And so really, if you think about it that way, if you just get one client from this, every other client from that is pure profit. And they're like, oh, I never thought about it that way, which is unsurprising because financial advisors aren't marketers, right? And so are you really looking at things as expenses, or are you looking at them as investments? And I want you to, if anything, take from today is write down the list of things that you think you would be spending on your podcast and categorize, is this an expense or is this going to be an investment? And so, the other thing is, by the way, if you're not looking to monetize your podcast, that is totally cool. I had no intention of monetizing my podcast when I first started. True story, and if you've been to any of my other sessions, you've heard this probably a billion times by now, but I started the podcast because when my husband and I paid off the $72,000 of debt, I got a flood of DMs and emails asking to take me out for cups of coffee, to quote unquote pick my brain on how we did that. And I came home to my husband one day and I said, this is getting really tiring, saying the same thing over and over again. I wish I could just record how we did this and then just send it to people. And then I wouldn't have to go to all these cups of coffee. Also, because I'm a crazy introvert and it's takes a lot of energy out of me. And he said, that's called a podcast, right? And I was like, oh, is that what a podcast is? And so that's why I did the podcast. Initially, it was just to save time in my own life. I had no intention of monetizing. I had no intention of turning it into a business. And so it's totally okay if you're going into this podcast as a hobby, if you just really enjoy it. I thoroughly actually just enjoy sharing my message with people. And it makes me so happy when someone says to me, I listened to your podcast and it helped me pay off debt. That to me is rewarding in and of itself. But if you do have any inkling of turning it into a business, then my strong recommendation is that you start with that mindset from the beginning, which is a mistake I made, which was I didn't have that intention. And then I had to kind of play catch up after the fact. If you are thinking of turning this into any sort of, profitable product, then you want to start treating it as a business from the very beginning. And so I've been talking for a good couple of minutes. Let me pause. Sarah, are there any questions or comments in the chat box?
Hi. Actually, no, we only have we have one right now, but I think we should just see if we can get some more questions. We'll just do it towards the end.
Okay,
but
sounds good.
With some time, yeah.
All right.
So we can get a good list for you. Okay.
Sounds good. All right, we'll keep chugging along. To be honest, I just want an excuse to drink more water, so that's that's fine. All right, so we talked about C. Let's talk about R, which is reverse engineer your goals. So what do I mean by reverse engineer? If you're not an engineer, this concept is simple, is that a lot of people start out with the idea of like where they are and then where they want to be and work up to that point. And I challenge you to think about the opposite. Where do you want to be with this podcast and work backwards from it, right? So if your goal is to make a certain dollar amount of it, then you reverse engineer that. If your goal is to have a certain amount of listeners, to reverse engineer that. If your goal is just to like produce a certain amount of episodes, then reverse engineer that. Instead of going like, oh, let me like work up to it, decide where you want to be, put a hard line in the sand and work backwards from it. And so what I love to talk about in this section is that, you know, what can you use a podcast for, right? And there are three things that I don't necessarily see people really using the idea of podcasting. And a lot of people just, again, like me, right, go into podcasting saying like, I just think it'd be fun. I think it'd be cool to do. I have a story to tell. I think it's a really important message. But, you know, especially if you're someone who has an existing business, a podcast can be a great way to extend the brand of your business in a way that's really authentic and that can reach a different audience. And so the three ways that I have personally used my podcast, aside from having an outlet to talk without actually having to like see people, but also having a way to share my story, is the first thing is as a channel to build your brand and create awareness around your business or your message. And so interestingly, when I started doing media type stuff, so since launching the podcast, I've shifted over to do a lot more written articles and videos and TV type stuff. And where I got my first credibility was as a podcaster, which I did not really think about. And so the story goes that here, many of you are based in Charlotte, is, you know, WCNC reached out to me and said, we heard your story. Someone listened to your podcast and told us about your story. Would you want to come and be on our, you know, Charlotte Today, on our TV show? And I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And so I went on the TV show, but they introduced me as podcaster Bernadette Joy. And I was like, oh, I'm a podcaster now. Like, I didn't like, yes, I have a podcast. I didn't consider myself a podcaster. And that in of itself from the podcast went to help build my brand on the TV station. Then the TV station started asking me to be a regular on that. And then they started asking me to do primetime stuff. And then NBC picked up what I was doing on the local thing, and it started building from there, right? And so even if you're not making money from the podcast itself, it's a great way to build awareness around your brand and provide credibility for you, because not everybody has a podcast. The other thing to consider is that, and this is probably the most obvious, is to consider the podcast as a product itself. But the way that most people think about that is by going out and looking for advertisers. But is there a way for you to take the content of the podcast itself and be able to use that content in order to sell what you've got going on? So for me, for example, I have taken pieces of that podcast and I've been able to take those pieces of those podcasts, turn them into social media campaigns, and make those social media campaigns, you know, where I can go to get people to take a class with me or to read the next article with me. And I've also had people who've been willing to pay to be on my podcast, which was so interesting to me, because I was thinking like, oh my gosh, who's going to want to talk on my podcast? And who's going to want to be a guest? Like, I don't even know how to begin with that. And it turns out people are reaching out to me saying like, they considered it as a great marketing opportunity. And so they're like, oh, what's your fee to be on your podcast? It's like, oh, can I do that? Turns out you can, right? And so you can make money that way as well. And then lastly, and I started talking about this as a lead magnet into your other products or services. So using the podcast as a way for you to have visibility into your brand, but can it be a way to get people introduced to what you do so that they are more interested in what other kinds of things you can offer them. And so there's a lot of people, and I've been on panels with other folks, right, in this Charlotte Podcast Festival. By the way, I'll plug, go check out, like Sarah said, go check out all those other sessions. That many of the people have the podcast as a way to engage people in a way that is authentic and is part of their brand, but can lead them into their business. And one of the things that I've also used the podcast for is that even if someone is not ready to spend money with me, the podcast is a great way to still be able to offer a solution to people who might just be looking for help. So perfect example, 2 weeks ago, I was on Good Morning America. I got a flood of DMs and requests from people saying like, I need you to help me with my debt. But because I'm in so much debt, I can't pay you, which, fair, totally fair. You feel like you're in a lot of debt. You can't pay me to take a class with me. You can't pay, for my membership or anything like that. And so what did I offer to them? I said, I understand that you're not in a position to pay right now. Here is my podcast. You can listen to that for free and get some of the information that you're looking for without me having to spend, extra time when I could be using that time to service clients who do have the ability to pay. And so I would love for you to consider any of these things for your own podcast and not necessarily just doing the advertising route. And so here are some, examples of how I've extended my brand of the podcast. And so, as I mentioned, I've done some national TV type stuff with like CNBC and GMA. I also turned this into a full financial education business. So the Crush Your Money Goals business is an extension of the podcast where I've taken the content that I've talked about in the podcast and turned it into live classes with another company called Skill Pop, which is also a female-owned business local in Charlotte. Check it out. And I've also been able to get paid speaking gigs and paid writing gigs talking about the things that I normally talk about on my podcast. And so, for example, I'm a featured editor for Time Magazine, and I get paid to write articles for them, which also helps me extend my brand and goes hand in hand with the things that I talk about on the podcast. All right, so that is C, that is R. The next piece is U, which is using your resources efficiently. And the first thing I will say, above all else, if you get nothing else out of this, is to at least create a monthly budget on your podcast. And all those little things that you would actually need to create your podcast will add up over time if you are really like dedicated to the art that is podcasting. And so a lot of people will automatically think of like, okay, I have to buy a mic, right? I have to buy like the equipment, I have to buy the editing software and stuff like that. But there's a lot of other things that can go into making a podcast successful. And so creating a monthly budget for your podcast of how much you plan to either expend or invest, depending on what your mindset is super important to keep it on track. And I also and when I talk about using your resources efficiently, most people assume that I am only talking about money because I happen to be the Crush Your Money Goals girl. But I am even more important to me than money is time and energy. And so the title of this session is Don't Spend It All in One Place. Yes, we are here to talk about money, but to me, it's not worth, saving the money if it's going to cost you significantly on time and energy. And so there's two places that you will often look at in terms of where you're going to spend your time, energy, and money. One is on producing the product itself, meaning the actual podcast. So everything from the equipment, the production, the materials, and editing. And then the promotion part of it, which is what I've learned actually through this podcast festival, is that many podcasters do in fact go into podcasting because they just thoroughly enjoy podcasting, but then are very averse to the promotion side. But if you want to get listeners, it's a necessary evil of doing some promotion, and that can include marketing, advertising, social media, public relations, and placement. And so what I actually, in my normal Crush Your Money Goals classes, I talk about, the importance of spending on what you love. And that is where you should spend, like a lot of the debt advice, if any of you know, like a Dave Ramsey or like a Susie Orman, there's like a lot of like judgmental shame and guilt around like, you shouldn't be spending money on coffee and lattes and avocado toast. And Like, yes, avocado toast is totally the reason why we're all broke, right? Not the like significant student loan crisis in America, but I digress, right? Is for podcasting, I actually recommend to do the opposite, which is to spend on what you don't love. As in, if you just thoroughly enjoy a part of the podcasting process and that's something you would be doing anyway because you just get a kick out of it, then I would not recommend outsourcing that. But if there's something that you don't enjoy, then that is where I do recommend that you spend some money and you save yourself the time and energy so that you can stay on the podcast for the long haul. One of the other podcast panels that I was on actually on Tuesday was the podcast struggle is real. How do you avoid burnout? And one of the ways I've been able to avoid burnout is I don't try to produce this whole thing by myself. I would have burned out 3 seasons ago if that were the case. So here are some things to consider in terms of investing, right? So again, change your money mindset. Like, things are going to cost you money, but it's an investment because it is going to produce either a return on the dollar that you spent or a return or a savings on the time and energy that you would have spent, right? And so some basic things is that, things that you may want to consider investing in is obviously just your like whole setup, the microphone setup, the headphones. Like, Sarah is a great example of what that should look like right now. It doesn't cost a lot of money, but it will save you a lot of time in the editing process later on if you have the right equipment in place. I also would not shy away from getting a membership into, an existing podcasting studio. They are already well set up. The reason that I am part of the Queen City Podcast Network, plug for the Queen City Podcast Network, is because they know what they're doing when it comes to equipment. And I want zero to do with the actual like equipment, like figuring out the technical aspect of it. I like can barely get myself on a Zoom call. And so let alone try to, edit an entire, podcast episode. And so that is where I have spent, I have taken the deliberate decision to outsource, that to someone who's an expert like Sarah, right? Zoom also is something, it's a small investment. I think most of us need Zoom anyway, but it is a great tool to have for your podcast, even as a recording tool as a basic minimum. If you don't want to go into the super fancy stuff, I've been on 20 podcasts as a guest and half of them have been over Zoom. And so that's a low cost way of, getting started at all. Another one that I would suggest is either getting a Acuity or Calendly. I happen to use Acuity, but those are both scheduling tools that if you are going to have a podcast with guests on your show, then it makes it super easy to not have to go through the whole rigmarole of like, when are you available? When are you available? Like, just set up an Acuity or a Calendly. I think Calendly is free. Acuity I like because I can do a whole bunch of other stuff with it with my classes. But it's a very low cost in exchange for just getting really, really streamlined with your scheduling and your planning for upcoming sessions. Libsyn is another great tool. That's how my podcast has been distributed to all the other platforms. It's still also relatively inexpensive given the bang for your buck on that. And if you haven't guessed already, I am a big fan of the Queen City Podcast Network. Having a professional editor working on your podcast makes such a big difference. If not for my first season, my editor was a guy named Andy Go. He is awesome. He's also been a speaker on the podcast festival. But if not for him, my podcast would have sounded like crap. I'm going to be honest with you. Like, he did such great work in terms of sound engineering and like really challenging me to kind of push the envelope in what we were doing from a quality perspective. And so even though it might cost you some money up front, the product will be that much better if you have someone who knows what they're doing. And then on the promotion side, and this is the piece where I actually have chosen not to outsource because I actually just thoroughly enjoy promotions and marketing. Like, that is kind of my jam. And so I have chosen to outsource on the technical side, but I do a lot of this in-house. However, these are some of the things that I strongly recommend that you would take some investments in. One, very obvious, have a really nice website. You can obviously do a website for pretty cheap. It doesn't have to be super fancy, just a simple landing page, but the main expectation is that people need to be able to find you. Canva is my favorite tool. I use it on a daily basis. This entire presentation was made on Canva. It is a really great, easy way if you do not want to hire a graphic designer to do your art or do your, your social media stuff, to be able to do your own graphics, and it looks really nice. Email software, so like a MailChimp. I personally I use a platform called Kajabi, which covers my website and my email software. But prior to using that, I used MailChimp, and having an email distribution list that you can also like let people know when your next episodes are going. Social media is not the only way to do that. And I've gotten really good at figuring like punchy subject lines, and have been seeing a noticeable difference. And so it's a great way to promote your podcast as well. Facebook ads in the very beginning, in order to just get some traction, I absolutely bought some Facebook ads just so I could see. And it was more so even just from like the targeting aspect, to see like if I tried different segments, like who was actually clicking on it. And it gave me a good sense of who my target audience would be, and that helped me tailor my content going forward. And again, Facebook ads are relatively inexpensive. Public relations, this is something that if you really are trying to like build an audience, I would strongly suggest at least entertaining the idea of having someone work on your public relations. When I first started, this is a true story. I had someone I knew. She was a publicist, and she needed help with some services that I did. And I said, "Hell, hey, I'll trade you what I do for what you do." And she's like, "Sure, that's a no-brainer. I'll help you, publicize your podcast." And so she helped me put together a launch party for it. This is before COVID times, right? But we did a whole launch party around it. She got me a TV segment on it. She got me featured in some local news about it. And that in of itself was like definitely worth the trade for building my audience relatively early on. And then lastly, photography and video. I would say at least in the beginning, it is worth it to get some professional photography, some of those like lifestyle shots of like, you in the podcast studio with your headphones, and like you talking in front of an audience or whatever it is, like those photos, especially nowadays during COVID time, that people can't see anyone in person, that if you want people to like kind of understand what your credibility is, those images really make a difference. And then video, I actually have someone who does my videography for me, and I have done videos of my podcast episode. So like we'll record the podcast episode in the studio, and he'll also be recording it on video, and I've taken those videos and be able to use that to promote both the podcast and my brand overall. All right, so we covered C, covered R, covered U and S, and so the last piece is hustle, hustle, hustle. And why I say hustle, hustle, hustle 3 times is because I don't think there's any one right way to do any of this stuff. But if you, by the way, this is all talking about like things you should, like you could spend your money on, but I also wanted to give you some options of how you can get about this for free if you're not ready for the investment yet, on how you can build your own platform. And so the first thing that I will just say right off the bat is the easiest thing that you can do is to just be a guest on other podcasts. I have gotten some great opportunities to be on other podcasts, which has been great way to cross promote what we're doing, but also to be able to test out my material before I put it on my own podcast, right? And so this past week, I did a podcast episode with another great finance podcast, which has a similar audience to mine, Yo Quiero Dinero podcast. And it's for like the Latina community about personal finance. And I was like, this is amazing. I am so excited about this. And, and she has, a stronger following than I do on her podcast. And so, yeah, it was totally a great opportunity. And then thanks to the Charlotte Podcast Festival, I was on a panel discussion twice with Sherry Lynch, right? Our local, radio celebrity. And then right after the last panel discussion, Sherry's like, "You're going to be my podcast." And I was like, okay. So, look out for those other podcasts. And I was just talking about this with Joni right before the call, but the podcasting community is one of those few places that it's not it's not competitive, as in just because someone listens to my podcast doesn't mean they're going to not listen to your podcast. If anything, it's the other way around. If someone likes my podcast, then it benefits you to be on my podcast so that you can get a similar audience. And so consider this a community, just how WFAE has brought us all together for this podcast festival. I'm sure, like, even in this chat box right now, you can go in there and say, like, hey, who has an interesting story and wants to be in my podcast? And you'd be surprised at how many people are willing to do that. So that's one. The next thing is to bring your podcast to other forms of media. And so taking the content that you've created on your podcast, and true story, right now, as we speak, I have someone who is transcribing my podcast for me. And I'm paying her to do it because I don't want to do it, right? But I'm having her transcribe these podcasts so that I can go back and look at the content and see what of this content can I then turn into an article for Time, or that I can then turn into a YouTube segment, or then I can bring as a possible segment for local television, right? And so bringing your podcast to other forms of media is a great way to build your platform. And you're probably going to hear this a lot of times, and it sounds very cliche, but having a regular marketing schedule and just getting consistent with what you want to do. And it doesn't have to be crazy. Like, I'm on a daily schedule with my social media, but even I think that's too much. And so even if you get on a regular schedule of doing like a weekly, like one weekly email or one social media podcast, if promotion is not your thing, just putting yourself on a schedule will help reduce some of the like, I don't want to do it. So before we take questions, I just wanted to share some other resources. If you liked this session, then I would invite you to come to see me in other things that I do. You can, in fact, consult with me if you want to talk about your, how you want to brand your podcast. I have a lot of clients that I help. One of my clients is another podcaster who is another speaker on this Charlotte Podcast Festival. You can also check out my membership. I have my Crush Your Money Goals membership, where we are not only talking about business and stuff, but how do you actually manage all of your finances so that you can do the things you like podcasting. You can take a skill pop class with me. I teach 5 classes a month. I will also put in a plug for Andy Go's podcast class. He teaches on skill pop as well, and that's actually how I met him, and he became my producer. It's a great class. Please check out my podcast, Dear Bernadette Joy podcast, particularly the first season. It's my favorite. And if you search my name on Google, Bernadette Joy, you can find free articles from other outlets and videos and stuff just on my story. So that is me. This is how you can find me. Feel free to email me. And I would love to connect with you in social media. I love hearing how people's business ventures and things are growing. And so I will totally check you guys out if you let me know where to find you. Awesome. We have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, are you ready?
Oh, yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Yes, sorry. I've got kind of a little script here too that I'd like to use. Okay, so it is time for questions from the audience. If you still have a question, you can still put it in and we'll try to get to it as well. But I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one. This one is from Nikki. How do you suggest getting rid of the garbage regarding your attitude about money?
Oh, yes. Great question. So the obvious shameless plug is to take a class with me. But aside from that is something that I do with a lot of my consulting clients is just to lay it all out. Like, literally write down on a piece of paper, what are all of the reasons or excuses that you're telling yourself that you don't want to monetize this. And I find this especially true with my female clients. I read an article yesterday that was about a founder who got like ousted out. It was on Inc. I'm forgetting the name of the founder right now, but it was on Inc. And she got ousted from her own startup after they raised all this money, and it was valued at like $50 million. And she said one of the things that it was a real struggle for her, and as a female, was that while men went out into these businesses and said they were not apologetic at all, and in fact was considered a strength that they are here to make money, all of the women founders, even though they had multi-million-dollar businesses, they had to go in media and stuff and talk about I'm here to help people, or this is why my why my business, is sustainable or has a mission and all that stuff. And yes, that is absolutely all important. I don't suggest you go out and not have a mission and just go out and make all the money, but we shouldn't apologize for wanting to make money, right? And it doesn't make you greedy. It doesn't make you selfish. Like, wanting to support your family and secure your financial future is actually a very good thing, in my opinion. And so I would suggest to write down all the reasons, all the excuses that you've kind of told yourself as to why you have this like mental block around making money, and then write the reason, reframe that to say, okay, like, instead of saying this, I'm going to tell myself this, and then actually go out and look for content that supports the more positive approach versus the excuse that you've told yourself.
Good advice. Megan asks, how did you determine like where, how much, and when to make investments in your podcast when your podcast wasn't making money?
Great question. So the first thing that I thought of is like, what do I really don't want to do? Like, even with all the excuses, I was like, okay, I just literally don't want to do this. And so the reason that I decided to go out and get the first investment I made was to hire someone to do the podcast for me. And I decided to make that investment because I was like, I could learn how to edit a podcast. I mean, I feel like I'm a pretty intelligent person. I could figure this out probably, but that comes at the opportunity cost of me working on other pieces of my business that do make money and that I make more money doing, and the time that it would take me to learn it, the learning curve and the product in return probably wouldn't be as good. And so I'm so glad I did it. I was like, well, let me go find someone who knows what they're doing, and I don't have to spend all this time on the learning curve, and the product will be better faster than I would have done it myself. And so my first suggestion to you is to look at the areas where you think you're going to spend an inordinate amount of time or energy. And if there is a resource that would accomplish that faster and better than you could, it's worth considering putting the investment in.
Okay. So, okay, we're kind of shifting gears. I guess Terry asks, have you written books on this subject? And have you found people need more financial guidance since the pandemic?
Have I written a book? So, okay, here's a fun story. Is I've been told that I should write a book. And again, I'm like, I don't want to, because that seems like very overwhelming. And I also said, I don't have any time. And so this past week, I've decided to do this digital detox where like, so the first day I literally stuck my phone in the glove compartment of my car, and I live on like a 3rd floor condo right now. And so I was like, I'm going to stick my phone in my car, and I'm going to see like if it creates more time. That Saturday, I like made granola. I like played my husband in 4 board games and beat him in all of them. Like, my mental clarity was just like rocking that day, and I started writing my book because like I have nothing else to do. Turns out you have a lot of free time when you don't have a phone. And so yes, I'm writing a book on some of this stuff. I'm finally getting the juices flowing. But guess what, guys? You know where the first parts of my book is coming from? The transcriptions from my podcast. That is where I'm starting my book from. I already have a ton of content out there. It's just not written down on paper yet. So that is, so the long answer to your question is yes. And then absolutely yes. The good news about my business with Crush Your Money Goals, whether the economy is good or bad, or people have a lot of money or don't have a lot of money, everyone needs help with finances, but I'm finding especially during this time.
I will totally read your book. So
thank you.
Yeah, it's going to be really helpful, I think. So Kelly asks, can you lose credibility by accepting money from guests?
I mean, I think you would lose credibility if you didn't disclose it, yes. And I also think you would lose credibility if you are accepting money from people who are not aligned with your brand. So if you go to my Instagram, actually the post that I posted yesterday, this is a true story, is in the last month, I have gotten offers to promote like various financial services, like workout clothes, luxury watches. And just this past week, I got an offer for a large sum of money to promote a very well-known credit card brand. And I turned down every single offer because none of those partnerships make sense with what I do. And like my immediate response was to the credit card company. I was like, do you not see what I do for a living? Like, this doesn't make any sense. I said it in a nice way, right? But I was like, I literally cannot, I would not and cannot promote that because it is entirely against what I teach, right? So I think the question is not of whether or not you accept money. The question or not is if you are really being true to what your messaging is. And here's the other thing too, is that for me, I will also say the opposite for me is true, is that if I continue to do what I do with the amount of work that I put into it and I kept doing it for free, that would also be against what I teach. Because what I teach in my classes is to tell, and especially women, to get what you're worth, right? So I say this all the time. I did not become debt free. I did not pay off $300,000 of debt in 3 years by working for free.
Good answers. So this is a question from the audience. Which program or platform would you recommend creating a budget on? And what are the basic columns or categories in a budget?
Again, short answer is I have a budgeting class coming up, and that's a 90-minute class, so I wouldn't be able to cover all of it in this session. But I personally would start from the very basic of pen and paper. Sounds really technologically advanced, but a lot of people assume that there's like some magic tool out there that's going to help them, and that's like what's wrong with their budget. And what's really wrong with people's budgets is that they're not doing it, first of all. That's number one. Number two, they are doing it in a way that's like not, again, not true like to how they function. And actually 50% of my clients all use just regular pen and paper. Some of them, and then the balance of them use Excel spreadsheets, and very few of them actually use the same tool that I use, which is EveryDollar. And so my first thing to use before you even go out and look for any tool is write down on a piece of paper. I have 3 clients who are doing this in process right now, who I'm going to be talking to right after this. And they've like literally sent me pictures of their paper, and I'm like, that's totally fine with me. Is write it down on paper and write down the 3 areas that you should have is what your income is to start off with, which this is the one that everybody misses on a budget. Everyone thinks a budget is just what your expenses are, but the first thing on your budget should be how much money you think you're going to be making, and then all of your expenses, and then any goals that you have. And then if you'd like to learn more about like how that should be split up, check out my budgeting class.
Okay, so we've got another question from the audience. How do you know whether you should do something for free or pro bono for versus ask for payment, compensation? For instance, when somebody asks to like pick your brain.
Oh, that's such a good question. And I wish I had a really good answer for you in the sense of like, oh, like I wanted to be like, oh yeah, I was totally boss from the very beginning and I started charging. No, I've been doing free-ish for like 3 or 4 years now. That's how I know not to do it anymore, right? Is once you've done it and you've gone into your mindset of like, oh, like I'll just do it for free. Like I'll just do it for free. Like it'll lead to this. You can do that. I mean, I would always say like, if you're starting from scratch, like it doesn't hurt if you have the time or the energy to do that, because what you're trading is time and energy then instead of money. But I learned, and this is from my first business too, this is not from the podcasting and from Crush Your Money Goals, but I learned this from Dressed as well, my first business, is that you really have to still figure out what the return on investment is going to be, right? And so if you, like, so for example, right, like I get asked to be on podcasts all the time, right? Doesn't take a lot of time and energy for me because obviously you can see I like talking, so it doesn't bother me, right? But I was just telling AJ this morning, I was like, you know, whenever we get out of this COVID world, I actually don't want to go back to live speaking, like as in person, because the time and energy requires me to like put on some actual clothes and drive myself to a location and sit in a waiting room and do all this other stuff. I learned this year that I'm able to do TV segments, like national TV segments and stuff from the same setup that you see me doing right now. And so like those have all been free, but the return on investment is way high and the cost for me is very low. What I would also suggest is that if it doesn't feel right, if it doesn't feel like it's a good use of your time, just don't do it. Like, that's my opinion. And I will say this, just even this past week, I had 3 requests for people being like, we'd love to feature you on our blog, or we'd like to feature, like, another really big website was like, we're collecting, thoughts from, financial experts. Would you want to contribute to this article? And I said, sure. What do you need from me? And she's like, okay, great. Can you write a 400, word article and send it to me by tomorrow? I was like, no. and I said, first of all, is this a paid opportunity? Because there's another subsidiary of your company that does pay me to write articles. Second of all, I did not recognize what the time constraint was going to be, and I literally don't have the time. And even if I did, I don't really want to. And 3, like, what is the return on investment for me? So you put me in an article with 10 other people, and it's on your website that doesn't get a lot of traffic. Like, it doesn't really make sense for me to do that. So it's okay to say no.
That's great. So I've got a question from Jesse. Jesse would love to know how the structure for compensation works. When we're budgeting a podcast that is likely to be licensed, do we include fees for our own time?
Wait, repeat the question again. It seems like there's like 3 questions rolled in one. So let me see if I can just adjust it.
Got it. So it's I guess first, okay. They want to know how the budget for compensation works, and when budgeting a podcast that's likely to be licensed, do we include fees for our own time?
Okay, great questions. So 1, I have not licensed my own podcast, so I wouldn't be able to answer you on that. However, I think the general gist of your question is, how much should I be charging for the time that I'm spending on it? And this is probably like not the answer that you're looking for, but it's really up to you on what you want to charge for your time. I personally have, I always use other benchmarks of what I get paid on other things to do. And then from there, I kind of like level set of like, do I like this thing more? Or do I like this thing less than that other thing that I do? And so usually if it's something that I don't really enjoy doing, I'll charge more for it. And if it's something that I actually enjoy doing, I might charge less for it because I'm like, hey, I'm still getting paid to do something that I enjoy. That's just my personal philosophy. So as an example with the podcast itself, right, is that in my first season, when I started monetizing, the basic reason that I was doing that was just to at least break even on my costs, right? Because I was already spending money on an editor. I was already spending money on a video producer and all that stuff. And so I was like, hey, you know what? It would be a pretty big win if I could produce this podcast at no cost to me, right? And so that was the basic of where I started. And then once I started like seeing, okay, who are the people who are willing to pay and how much, and because by that time, season 3 came around, I was like a well-oiled machine. I was able to figure out the cost according to like a lower amount of time because we had figured out all the kinks, and I had put in some of the stuff like the Calendly and the process that I had for it, and it made it a lot easier. So it actually, even though I charged the same amount, it became more efficient, which is why I say use your resources efficiently. It became more profitable because it took us less time to do it every single time.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry. I've got a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Good. So this one's from Molly. How much did you spend on promoting the first season, including the worth of the trade with the PR person?
I'm like doing the mental math in my head because I don't have it. It was like so long ago. I'm like, I probably have like an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. I would say it was ballpark like $1,000. Yeah. $1,000.
It's a good
Chunk of change.
number. Yeah. So we have a final question. It's from Shauna.
Uh-huh.
Any advice for creatives with no business experience on how to confidently start a podcast through a business lens?
Oh, that's a really good question. So here's what I love about that. I get a lot of people say like, I don't have any business experience, right? And truth is we all have business experience, right? Because we've all either been customers, we've all bought something from a business, and we know what we like and don't like from those businesses. So That is one of the garbage things that you should stop telling yourself, ma'am or sir, is that, I don't have any business experience, so how can I do a business podcast? You can, because you know what business is. It's actually not that complicated. And I'm telling you this as someone who has 3 degrees and, including an MBA. Like, none of that taught me anything about business. Everything I learned about business was from actually doing the business itself. And so in terms of your question of like, how do I get started? What I would suggest to do is really, one of my favorite tools is StoryBrand. If you've never heard of it before, it is a great framework for marketing and really clarifying what your message is. And I would use that StoryBrand. You can literally just Google StoryBrand, and you can use that template to really clarify what the message and the point of your podcast is. And that would be a really great place to start.
Nice. Good answer. So, let's see. I think that was my last one. Okay. So, thank you. Thank you so much. And that is all the time we have for the Q&A. Thank you for everyone who submitted questions. And let's give a big round of applause for Bernadette Joy. A reminder to the audience that this session has been recorded and will be made available as an archive session. So keep an eye on your emails, including your spam and junk folders this weekend for the recording. We still have, actually today we have another session, and then we have a happy hour tomorrow. So this is the end of our last week of the podcast festival. And check the full list of sessions and speakers, on charlottepodcastfestival.com. And we will have those available this weekend so that people can view them after the fact. So you can share about your experience using the hashtag CLT Podcast Fest on social media. You can also support the festival by picking up a brand new, super soft, locally printed t-shirt at charlottepodcastfestival.com. Make sure to join us for the virtual podcast happy hour this Friday at 6 p.m., where you can mix and mingle with other podcasters from around the world, and register for it on the charlottepodcastfestival.com. Thanks again for attending today's session. I'm Sarah Pollock. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye, everyone.
Bye.